Black History Month, and I'm really pleased that we've got Brian Richardson from London, and unfortunately his work kept him from travelling to Bradford today, but it's absolutely fine because we've got him clearly here on Zoom. Brian is the author of a book, Tell It Like It Is, How Our Schools Fail Black Children. He is also an excellent speaker, and he's going to speak to us tonight on the Black Panthers fighting racism in the belly of the beast. Brian will speak for something like 25 minutes or so, and then the discussion will be open to everyone to chip in whatever they want, and then Brian will sum up, and then we have another section for the second part of the meeting. Over to you, Brian.
Well, thanks very much, Leslie. Good afternoon, good evening, comrades and friends. And yes, I'm genuinely sorry that I couldn't be there with you in person this evening. I've spent many enjoyable evenings in Bradford, and it would have been nice to have spent some time with you. But alas, I'm stuck in London. But at least you'll be pleased to know that one of the consolation prizes was that I was able to go to my infant daughter's Black History Month celebration and show racism the red card celebration today. So at least something positive has come out of my having to stay in London. Anyway, I'd like to begin, if I may, by taking you back not all the way to the 1960s, but instead to the 20th of January of this year, for a reason which I hope will become quite clear. Now, I don't know if any of you had the misfortune to watch the second inauguration of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States, which was on that day. You may recall that because of the bad weather, it was an event that was held indoors rather than traditionally held outdoors in Washington. I did watch that inauguration, and I noted with an increasing sense of nausea the contribution made by a black Detroit pastor, Lorenzo Powell, apparently a former gang member. At the inauguration, he delivered what is called a benediction, which amounted to a stirring rendition of the final words of Dr. Martin Luther King's legendary "I Have a Dream" speech. Powell's oration is available on YouTube, and it's worth watching. The reason why it was so nauseating was that within hours of that speech, Trump's inauguration and him embracing and telling the pastor what a wonderful person he was, Trump appeared at a public rally, his first public appearance after his re-inauguration, and at that public rally, in front of his own supporters, he signed a series of executive orders which sought to systematically dismantle and destroy the very equal rights agenda that Martin Luther King had fought so hard for and indeed ultimately sacrificed his own life for. Now, as you may know from your history, that King's speech was delivered in August 1963 and was arguably the high point of the civil rights movement that he was such a leading figure within. Within a year of that speech, there had been an 8th Civil Rights Act passed, and within another year of that, a Voting Rights Act passed, so supposedly delivering social and political equality to blacks in the United States. The reality was, however, that it failed, palpably failed to end racism and deliver equality as people had hoped. Indeed, the indication that it would not deliver freedom and equality was symbolised by the fact that literally within a month or so of King's great speech, there was a gruesome firebombing of a church in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed a number of young schoolgirls. So it was in those circumstances that although King himself remained an extremely popular figure personally, the methods that he pronounced, the idea of Christian forgiveness, moral superiority, moral suasion as it was called, and turning the other cheek to your oppressor increasingly came under attack, and increasingly blacks in the United States, not just in the southern states where King was primarily based, but right across America in the northern states, where what was known as the Jim Crow system of segregation did not exist. Blacks had formal equality, unlike in the South. Increasingly right across the United States, the more militant language of figures like Malcolm X began to gain greater prominence. Malcolm wasn't an entirely new figure on the political scene. He'd been around since the mid to late 1950s, but increasingly the message that he promoted, the idea of liberating oneself and fighting by any means necessary, that if a racist lays his hand on you, send him to the cemetery, those kind of ideas were gaining greater prominence. And indeed, Malcolm predicted the huge upsurges that would occur across America in the mid to late 1960s. Indeed, he argued that if you do not give us equality, if you do not give us the ballot, for one thing, then you will get the bullet, in one of his most famous speeches. Sadly, Malcolm didn't live himself to see those great struggles. One of the poignant things about this year is that it's both the 100th anniversary of Malcolm's birth, but it also marks the 60th anniversary of his death. He didn't live to see 40 years. The origins of the Black Panther Party, the subject of tonight's meeting, is in the aftermath of Malcolm. They erupted onto the political scene the year after Malcolm's death in 1966, and they were founded by two students at Merritt College, Oakland, California, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, in 1966, specifically in their words, in the spirit of Malcolm, in order to carry his life's work forward. If you know nothing else about the Panthers, the one thing that you may know is that they were most famous for what is what's so-called patrolling the police, the pigs, challenging and taking on the police. What did that actually mean, and where did it come from? As I said earlier, Newton and Seale were both law students who therefore studied the American Constitution as part of their law studies, and in so doing developed a particular interest in the constitutional right to bear arms. And it wasn't a completely original thought. There were others who thought this, but they moulded it into a central plank of what the Panthers did, arguing that black people should exercise their constitutional right to bear arms peacefully, primarily, but not peacefully if necessary, to confront and drive out their confront and drive out their oppressors. And it didn't just come from nowhere. Seale and Newton were themselves very much victims of the harassment, the bullying, the intimidation that black communities experienced. They experienced it from their youth, and therefore they fully understood and were steeped in the deep resentment and bitterness that black communities felt. They understood that oppression by the police was just the front line in the wider discrimination and exclusion that black people experienced. And therefore, instead of turning the other cheek, they argued that people should stand up for their rights and fight back if necessary. And the sight of them doing so was absolutely awe-inspiring. And moreover, they didn't just talk the talk, they very much walked the walk. Newton himself was famously charged with the murder of a policeman, and indeed he spent 2 years on remand for facing those allegations. Then initially he was convicted of manslaughter before a successful appeal led to his release. Seale himself, a number of times charged with very serious offences. There's a very famous sight of him when he sought to defend himself on trial, being literally manacled to a chair with his mouth gagged by the authorities because they didn't want an eloquent black man standing up for and speaking about the right of black people to develop themselves. And so this was something that was a central part of their strategy. If you read, for example, one of Newton's autobiographies entitled Revolutionary Suicide, more than half of the book is given over to descriptions of various direct confrontations between the Panthers and the police. And of course, as well as taking on the authorities, taking on the state in that particular audacious way, they looked absolutely fantastic, dressed in leather jackets, powder blue shirts and berets. They looked the part as well as talking the talk and walking the walk. But patrolling the police, taking on and confronting and driving the police out of black communities, much though it was a central plank of what the Panthers did and what they're arguably most famous for, and what they won a huge amount of respect from black communities for doing that. It was by no means the only thing that they did. They did so much more than that. That famously they organised breakfast clubs for black children to have a hot meal before they went into school. They organised education programmes for those very same children to rectify the rotten education that they received in schools, and ensuring, amongst other things, that they learned about black history and learned a sense of black pride. They organised medical programmes, vaccine programmes, a sickle cell anemia programme, amongst other things as well. And there was a very conscious and deliberate reason why they did all of these things. They recognised and understood that black communities were marginalised, discriminated against, oppressed and poverty-stricken. And therefore, organising these programmes was characterised as placing a life raft underneath those communities to enable their survival whilst they struggled for the ultimate liberation. And in fact, many of the programmes that contain the name of the Black Panthers, that were initiated by the Black Panthers, continued long after the organisation that had emerged so spectacularly in the late 1960s had ceased to exist, carrying on well into the 1970s and beyond. And let me just plug a couple of books whilst I'm here. Certainly this one, Black Against Empire, The History and Politics of the Black Panthers, is a fantastically important read. And this one as well, Comrades, Sisters, Women of the Black Panther Party, which it contains some fantastic photographs and stories. And that, I think, is particularly important for a number of reasons. One, Comrades, Sisters, as it's called, it talks about the contribution that women made to the Black Panther Party. From when people talk about patrolling the pigs, that kind of militant standing up, they have in mind the men of the Black Panthers. And of course, the likes of Newton and Seal were leading figures and so on. But it was by no means the case that all of the Panthers were men, or indeed that all of the people who patrolled the pigs, as it was called, were men. Women were very much in the front line of both that particular aspect of what the Panthers did, as well as the other programmes. Indeed, on occasion, it was considered particularly important that women were in the front line of the militant work, and men were taking responsibility for nurturing the children, feeding the children, and so on. And it was by no means something that's used as universal. One of the important things about Black Against Empire is that it talks about the tensions that existed, some of the arguments that ensued, and it's important to recognise we're still talking about an era, we're still talking about an era today, of course, where women are oppressed and that they could suffer serious sexual oppression, misconduct at the hands of fellow Panthers. But nevertheless, it was the case that there were very many leading Panther women, Assata Shakur, Athena Shakur, Elaine Brown, Kathleen Cleaver, amongst others, Angela Davis, briefly a member of the Black Panthers, but subsequently a fellow traveller and supporter of them. So it was that with a combination of that militant defence of black communities and the community programmes that the Panthers organised, that they gained their rise to prominence was absolutely spectacular. They had a huge amount of respect and influence within black communities. Something like 10% of people claimed to be members of the Black Panther Party. They weren't, but nevertheless, it was a mark of the respect that they had. They were selling, within a couple of years, 100,000 copies of their paper, the Black Panther. The influence was way beyond black communities. If you see, there's a film that came out a few years ago that's worth watching called Black Panther, Vanguard of the Revolution. And even you see in the trailer how they were able to reach out to and win the respect of wider layers of the community, including celebrities such as Jane Fonda, Marlon Brando, and so on, supporting the activities that the Panthers did. And so precisely because they burst onto the scene in such a dramatic way, precisely because they took the struggle pioneered by the civil rights movement, people like King, to another level, and a more dramatic and a more militant level, they represented a serious threat to American society and to the American state, so much so that the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, declared them public enemy number one. Didn't just declare them public enemy number one. What that meant was systematically organising a campaign of surveillance, intimidation, violence and brutality that led to violent repression and attacks upon the Panthers. In 1 year alone, 1969, 27 Panthers were assassinated by the police, including most famously Fred Hampton, and others who died at the hands of the police were our Prentice, Bunchy, Carter. So much so that therefore that having risen spectacularly in the mid to late 1960s, by the early 1970s, despite the popularity they had, despite the programs that they were running, the Panthers had virtually ceased to exist as an organisation, bar those few community programmes that I mentioned. And hopefully, people can talk about some of the other initiatives that the Panthers were involved in. One of the great examples in California, the biggest state in the United States, and the state where at the time the governor was a particularly rancid Republican, former B-movie actor called Ronald Reagan, who of course went on to become a two-term Republican president. As an especially right-wing governor, he systematically sought to attack the Panthers and all the people who they supported and represented and sought to defend. And there was a very famous example on the steps of the state capitol where the Panthers, armed, looking militant, armed with their guns and so on, managed to rally a whole crowd of people to chant, "Fuck Ronald Reagan, fuck Ronald Reagan." As I say, despite that, by the early 1970s, they hadn't just murdered the likes of Hampton, Carter, and others, but the state had essentially managed to destroy the Panthers. And there were a number of ways in which they did it. The state violence was absolutely brutal. The killing of Panthers, the trumping up of charges that meant huge numbers of them were incarcerated and therefore unable to organise. And actually, let me just pause there briefly, because one of the fascinating things you learn in the Black Against Empire book is the way in which the community programmes gradually came to play a much more dominant role, occupy a bigger place in the organisational activities of the Panthers compared to the militant organisation of self-defence. That happened in circumstances in which the two main leaders, the two main founders, Seal and Newton, as well as Eldridge Cleaver, one of whom later had become one of the key figures, they were either in prison on charges that they would ultimately defeat, or in exile. And in those circumstances, one of the other leading Panthers, I momentarily forget his name, will come back to me. He was, at that time, taking primarily the kind of interim chair of the organisation, and he was more committed to the idea of the community programmes and the self-defence. And therefore, during that period of time, he essentially ratcheted up the community programmes and increasingly kind of down-spooled the self-defence activities. Let me talk about the reasons why the Panthers ultimately collapsed. As I say, there was the state violence. There was also, one of the things that Hoover systematically did was organise a counterintelligence programme, COINTELPRO. Of course, they sent spies into the Panthers, they sowed misinformation, they sought ways in which to pit the leading figures of the Panthers against each other. And fascinating examples again in the book of how they sent spies in to derail the organisation, worked their way through the ranks, and then feed information back to the state, including unquestionably the information that ultimately allowed the police to break into the home of Fred Hampton and murder him, and creating stories of one Panther against another that led to a lack of trust amongst the leading figures and gradual splitting apart. So state violence, counterintelligence programme. Also, many people argue, and unquestionably there is some truth in this, the really flooding of drugs into black communities as a way of, sowing misery, creating a kind of pool of docile people unable to fight back. All of that is true and is worth further consideration. But there are a number of other points that I think explain why the Panthers ultimately collapsed. Firstly, the nature of being a Panther. I mentioned that 10% claimed to be Panthers. In reality, they were fellow travellers and supporters. To be a real Panther meant being a professional Panther, incredibly self-sacrificial, as that title, Revolutionary Suicide of Newton's autobiography suggests. It meant essentially the Panthers living away from the community in Panther communes and acting on behalf of people, substituting themselves for the community rather than organising the community itself. Where they did organise, their specific focus was on what they called the lumpen proletariat, the brothers on the block, the guys who were unemployed, hustling on the streets. They considered those to be the most militant and the ones who that they should focus in terms of organisation. In reality, precisely because of the precarity of the lifestyle of those people who were the lumpen proletariat, they were actually the most difficult to organise and the most difficult to discipline. I should also say something about the community programmes and so on, because important though they may have been as a life raft, if you like, they actually took a huge amount of effort and activity. And actually, if you think about it, they drew the Panthers into essentially reformist activities and reformist collaboration with the state actually drew them away from revolutionary activity and made it more difficult to organise revolutionary activity when you're actually trying to appeal to sections of the state for resources, accommodation, money, funding, and so on to run those programs. So it was a pull away from revolutionary activity. It was also the case, now I know that I need to wind up now, that, and the Panthers, these ideas didn't just come from nowhere. They had a political program. They were part of a political program. They had a 10-point political program. And there was a set of, if you like, demands placed by the Panthers on a wider society, such as decent homes, trials by your peers, education fitting for the black community, and so on. All of the reformist demands, the key demands, the 10th point of their programme was the United Nations sponsored plebiscite of all black people to decide on their future. Not only reformist, but I would argue, frankly, delusional. Already, by the mid-1960s, the United Nations was proving to be an organisation that served the interests of capitalist states. And there was primarily the United States, the dominant power in the aftermath of the Second World War. There was never any possibility that it could be turned into an instrument that was that could deliver the liberation of black people. So I think all of those are factors worth further discussion, which I think were factors in the demise of the Panthers. Arguably, an organisation that had that level of respect, that level of influence, that could sell 100,000 copies of its paper, had the potential at least to mobilise massive numbers of black people where they were at their strongest, the collective class basis, based within the working class. They had the potential to organise those, as well as using their influence with the wider community to reach out to white workers. Let me just say a couple of things in conclusion. What was their legacy? Undoubtedly, it was the case that the size, the strength, the sustained nature of the struggles and the way in which it fed into wider black power movement struggles in the late 1970s undoubtedly broke open space for a layer of blacks to move into positions of power and influence in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond. By the 1990s, for example, there were over 7,000 black elected officials across the United States, where, at the time the Civil Rights Movement was passed, there were barely a few hundred. By the 1990s, there were members of Congress, there were members of the Senate, members of the House of Representatives, and ultimately, of course, we know that by the 2010s, we had a black president, Barack Obama, in the White House. That wouldn't have happened without the struggles that organisations like the Panthers were centrally involved in. So that, they made the world an easier place for people to assert some kind of political influence, and they made it easier for black people to gain some kind of education, some better housing, some better living standards in the years and decades that followed. But what could be run from the capitalist state can also be taken back. Let me finish where I started. The fact that we see now not just Trump systematically seeking to roll back the gains of the civil rights era, but also sending militias in to round up migrants for deportation, sending the army into the states of political opponents in order to suppress and repress opposition, is an indication not just that things can go backwards, but that we are living in seriously dangerous times and that catastrophe could engulf us if we don't do something about it. The challenge, therefore, for us today is to take inspiration from fantastic, militant, determined fighters like the Panthers, to learn, why it was that they were able to gain such a level of support within a short space of time, but why it was that their demise was as spectacular as their fall. There was a potential. I love the Panthers. I have a huge amount of admiration for them, but I think they ultimately failed to a large extent because they failed to take the opportunity to think deeper roots, not just within the black working class, but within the wider mixed black and white working class. And that is a challenge that faces us today if we're going to ensure that we stand on the shoulders of those giants, but see further and more clearly in order to develop the kind of organisation and to win the kind of battles that we need to face today and in the future. Okay, thanks, Leslie. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you.